So moving on a little bit, I wanted to talk a little bit more about your work with the public. So in addition to all of the research being done at the UBC farm, you also do a lot of tours and you do a lot of work with the public. So what topics do you think are really important to the public that producers should be aware of or should take a little more seriously?
I guess to start off here, I'd say that, I mean, the big message really is that, and I think it's something we're already do pretty well in dairy. I think that this is, for us, one of the fun things about working in the dairy industry and working with dairy farmers is that we're not an industry that's afraid. We're pretty outgoing and open and good at engaging with the public. But I think we need to, we can't let our guard, we got to keep up the work on that, I guess is the way to say that. That it's really important, not just that UBC is holding open houses, but that all, that everybody tries to find opportunities to get that community involvement, whether that's, opening up your barn for your local school to come by. I know these are all things which we have to wait for COVID to pass, yes. but in the long term, this thinking about ways of really working hard to keep our farms open. And I think that's important in a number of ways, but perhaps most importantly is that it opens up conversations where we're not just showing people what we're doing, but we're opening the door to engage with our neighbors, our colleagues, our community about their values as well, and making sure that what we're doing, we need to work at keeping our practices in sync with broadly held community values. And if we just talk about what we do, that's not enough. We got to also put on our listening hats and open ourselves up for people to say things sometimes that are a challenge. And I know that, because we do that at our open houses, I know one thing that comes up time and time again is they want to see our cows outside. And so I think that's, of course, that's one of the reasons that's been driving the research that we're doing now, is try to find solutions then. It's not going to be one solution that's going to fit every farmer, but a variety of solutions that might fit a variety of different farms for how people can show, yeah, well, I'm taking that seriously. These are the things I'm trying to do to give my cows more outdoor access.
I echo everything that Dan says. One of the things that I've had a lot of conversations about farmers is usually within each region, you've got these farmers that have their open farm days, and which I think is fantastic. But often what comes out of that is the farmers say, look, I give everybody a tour, and they do a tour of my facility, and I ask them if they have any questions at the end, and I don't get anything back. So I think they really like what I do. I've often said to them, I said, be very careful with that, because I think of, and I often, when I do these talks, I put myself in, I ask them to do a bit of frame reflection. I said, okay, now imagine you're going through some physics plant or nuclear physics plant, and some person has just now told you for half an hour about whatever is happening there, and I'm nodding, and then they ask me if I have any questions, which puts me on the spot a little bit, right? And I don't know what to ask. I think a better question for us to do, and this then leads into what Dan was saying, is there anything on my farm that really bothers you? Because then we can have a conversation about that. And because I think we have to be very careful that we're not testing the public, because I think then, we don't like to be tested. And so I think it's about how we have those conversations, and not just having the conversation. We need to also be not afraid to talk about things that we find uncomfortable. I can't tell you how many times I've been in the room, and most recently, and this was like just before COVID, with a bunch of farmers, and this was in the Maritimes, where the whole Transport Canada thing had changed with the bull calves, and this farmer was actually in tears because he didn't know what to do with his bull calves. And I think if we're honest about those, we don't have the solution tomorrow, but if we actually say, look, these are things that we don't like, we need to figure out how to do this better. And also, just one other point there is, and I just had this conversation yesterday because somebody was asking me on this webinar I was doing and saying, look, how do you respond to somebody that and is about cow-calf separation? How do you respond? Mm-hmm. And I've never actually tested this, but I think this is where science can help us. Not in saying that science is shows that it's a good practice. But what I say to them, I said, look, you know, on our dairy at UBC, if somebody asks about that, I say, look, 20 years ago, we fed our calves 4 liters of milk. We fed it through a bucket. We've done all this research that calves like more milk. They want at least 2 to 2.5 times as much of that. We now feed them through a nipple, and we do all those things, and now we can socially house. And so over the last 20 years, I've applied science and I've improved my practice. And in 25 years, if somebody can figure out how to keep these animals together, then I'm there. And all of a sudden now you've aligned yourself. You're not contradicting the values of the public. You're actually aligning themselves and saying, look, I'm trying to get better.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And it kind of ties into the next question I was going to ask, is that this is really kind of a new and more challenging area for our producers, is to have these conversations where it's, you know, it's emotional for the producers and this is their livelihood and they're doing the best they can. It's emotional for the public because of course it involves animals and their expectations of how their food is being raised and produced. So just, you know, how to have that conversation in a constructive way.
Great question, Kara. And I think the, you know, and maybe this is just part of modern reality. I mean, us as, you know, our day jobs were also, you know, university teachers, right? And that whole model's being blown up right now with COVID. And so we're having these conversations about how do we sort of reinvent what we do and how do we make sure it's effective and how do we sure that fits sort of the needs of our students in the long term in that society. And those can be hard conversations for sure. And I think that all you can do with that is be sympathetic to people, to acknowledge that, yeah, there's a lot of history involved. There's a lot of tradition. There's also on, you know, most Canadian farms are family farms and people are trying to manage that intergenerational aspect too, right? So, you know, it's partly what dad did or maybe what grandpa did too, right? And how do you manage that? So I think that, you know, some sympathy and patience is super important. But I do think we need to find opportunities to be having those conversations more actually also within the dairy industry. I think one of the challenges, nobody likes being told what to do by somebody outside, right? Is that somebody, you know, the idea is that, you know, I mean, even I was thinking when Nina was saying about these things that people don't like within the industry. Just like I said, I've never met a dairy farmer who said they want to switch back after they started using pain mitigation for disbudding. I never met a dairy farmer that said they liked disbudding their calves. Certainly not before using pain mitigation. So, you know, these are things that I think we've long realized ourselves. These are unpleasant chores for us and for the animals. And we need to start by talking about that and then sort of acknowledging these are the things which may put that in a positive way. What are our dreams for our industry? What is the industry which we want to have that we're going to be proud to pass down to our grandchildren, and that we're sure the people living in our grandchildren's community, our grandchildren's neighbors are going to want to be consuming products from that farm. And I think that's up to us to have that, to actually, I think, help lead that conversation. Yeah, we need to have input and have that conversation collegially with our broader community. But I think that it's right that we lead that from within the industry. And I think often we just haven't been actually good about having those sort of hard conversations about who we are and where we want to go. And that's definitely a place we need to start with.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it really comes down to, and I think as an industry, you know, those conversations are what many other professions have. They just call it a strategic plan. What is your vision? What is your mission? And not just in 2 years or 5 years, but where do you see yourself in your industry in 20, 30, or 40 years down the road? And I do believe, and maybe this is Nina just being overly optimistic and naive about it, but I do think if we start to articulate those things, that the public will get it. I mean, the public knows that you can't change overnight. They know that. You know, and it came to, like, we were talking about outdoor access, and I was in Europe once, and had like 1,000 farmers in front of me, and I was talking about, you know, some of the potential criticisms from the public on the dairy industry, and it was about, yeah, the type of housing system for keeping cows and trying to get lameness under control. And I said to them, and one of the individuals said, well, look, Canada still has like 75% tie stalls. And I said, look, it's a traditional type of housing system. We don't have that much in the West, but we recognize that it's associated with small farms and people are trying to move forward. But it's another example where, will that system do we see that system in 30 years or 40 years? And I said to the farmers this was in the UK, and there's very few tie stalls left. And I said, imagine 50 years ago, if I would have stood here and said that in 50 years, 95% of you would no longer be in tie stalls. And one farmer stood up, he goes, I probably would have yelled at you. And he's right, he probably would have yelled at me. But change does happen. It's not easy and it's hard, but we got to keep moving forward.
And it's way easier if we're part of the solution. So that if we can, within the industry, can do a good job of articulating our values and where we want to go, our sort of dream for where our industry wants to go, then I think that's a really good place to start these conversations off.
And I just one other point there is, I think we also have to be careful about, when Dan and I talked about opening the barn doors and doing all those things, I think what we're speaking about is transparency. We're not talking about educating the public. We're talking about being transparent and being able to have conversations about fact and about how we do things, not about educating the public to why we do things necessarily. I mean, we can be transparent about those, but those are two very different things. Agriculture, I mean, it breaks my heart, but we're a very small percentage of the Canadian public. And we need the Canadian public to support the dairy industry. So we need to figure out ways that we narrow this gap. We need to identify the gaps where public values and farmer values or the way we do things don't align, and we need to figure out how to narrow those gaps.
Yeah, and I truly agree with you that the transparency and kind of getting as many people out onto the farms as possible so they can see for themselves and then have that conversation with producers who know best to say, this is what I saw or this is what I felt. And yeah, sometimes those will be difficult conversations, but I think extremely necessary ones. Yeah,
but Kira, I guess I just want to say that Dan used the term, we also need to listen, not just tell, we need to listen. And I this was in the Okanagan, I was speaking and I said to they had all these open doors policy. And I said, look, I would love for you to have a checklist on the barn wall. And when people come out, you ask them, is there anything that bothered you that you saw today? Or what bothered you most? And you keep a checklist. And then over time, see, if everybody says, oh, it bothers me that the cows aren't outside, and after 2 years that checklist is completely full on that topic, maybe we need to do something about that.
No, I think that's a very great point, and I really like what you both said earlier about kind of aligning values for the future is maybe the best way to talk about it. And so that brings me to my final question, where I think, and we've talked about this already, but that all of our producers place a high value on their cows' health and welfare. But some of the newer discussions or recommendations that are coming out require that large infrastructure change or maybe has a negative impact on efficiency. So what would you say to those producers that are kind of wrestling with these big changes, that are maybe coming forward and are maybe becoming mandatory in the future?
So I think the thing there, Kieran, we have to sort of, thank our lucky stars for this as an industry. But we are in this amazing opportunity within Canada, but we have supply management is exactly the tool that allows us to solve this problem if we use it that way. So we have, this doesn't help if just one individual producer wants to try to do something a little bit different, a little bit better, then that's not necessarily going to help that person. But if we as an industry decided, let's say there was sort of an upwelling of support from within the dairy industry, Canadian dairy industry, that we said we need to do as Canada, we need to do something which really makes our Canadian products stand out from the rest of the world. And we said, okay, well, where conditions warrant, we're going to leave our barn doors open. That's going to be the made in Canada. We've got these beautiful barns where the cows can have this indoor access, but they can also have outdoor access. And we said, and let's say that worked out to be whatever, it doesn't matter, but let's say it was 5 cents a liter, it worked out, it costs more. Nina said earlier, it could actually be that it costs less, but anyways, let's it doesn't matter actually. That's the beauty of the supply management. It doesn't matter. Let's say it costs 5 cents more. Doesn't matter. We're the only place in the world where we could do this, where we can create this opportunity for us to farm according to our values, for us to farm in a way that meets our values of the society in which we live, and we've got a formula that pays us for that. So, but that doesn't happen on itself. I mean, it's easy for us to say that in this phone call. It's not us that make that decision. We need a larger body of Canadian dairy industry to make that call. But we could do that as a Canadian dairy industry if we wanted to. We just have to decide. That's the cost of production.
And the same goes for, the big issue now is this bull calf issue. We could come up with a solution that works for those bull calves, works for the farmers, and it just gets factored into the cost of production. And that issue is global. I mean, you've got Oceania, so New Zealand and Australia, all those calves are going to slaughter before they're 2 weeks of age. Can you imagine the outcry if people were to hear that this is what we do? We need to solve the problem. And we have a mechanism that would allow us to incorporate that into the cost of production. And I guess I also think, this is me, I'm not an economist but if you were to go to the public and say, look, in Canada, the reason milk is what it is because we value what you value, and our cows have access to the outdoors when the weather works and when the cows want to go outside. We've looked after the male calf issue. These calves are now being reared at home or doing whatever the solution is. Wouldn't that be a great way to differentiate yourself?
And to justify supply management.
And justify supply management as a public policy. Because right now, I think many of the public don't understand supply management because they may get it that we have very small farms compared to, let's say, our neighbors to the south. But that's the only thing. That's the only thing. And they may not even get that. But if they get something, it's just that. And how do we, if you have a glass of milk from Canada here and a glass of milk from the US here, what makes that milk different? And you take farm size off the table. Not a whole lot else, right? Yes, because it used to be that they used more BST. BST is almost gone in the US, right? Because the public said no. And that was one of the great things that Canada did really early on was say no to BST because they recognized that the public wouldn't like it. That was a great decision.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that you're saying. And that's something too that, proaction is only possible because of supply management.
Exactly.
And that's something that I think, producers, who are aware of it really value. And I think too, in the stores and certainly online, like we're already aware that consumers are willing to spend more money on products that they consider of higher welfare or higher environmental sustainability. So if that's something that we can incorporate in the system that's already in place, it really, I think it gives evidence that this is possible for producers to make this change for the better.
And I think maybe the last thing just to say on that, Kira, is that we spend our careers trying to work on solutions which are sort of win-win too. So we're not trying to create more expensive ways of producing milk. We're trying to create better ways of taking care of the cows and the calves that also make the lives better for farmers. And that often, so for example, if you think about coming back to the, feeding calves more milk issue that we talked about earlier, actually, what we're doing is we're feeding the calves way more efficiently. That even though we're taking that milk investment, moving it earlier in the calf's life, that's when the calf most benefits from it. and that maybe also invest in it more, especially in those calves that benefit most from it. So we're not necessarily, but I mean, I think this is something, again, this value of investing in research for the dairy industry is that it takes time to come up with those kinds of solutions, the kinds of solutions that really do work well from a number of perspectives. But I think those are also available. They won't always be available. So Nina pointed that out with, like, even if the cost of treating pain from just budding is relatively inexpensive, it's still something. It's still going to cost a few pennies a shot of lidocaine or something like this. And there might be things like that where we just say, no, look, as an industry, if I'm producing milk, I'm going to give calves lidocaine before I just bud them. That's what I do as a farmer. And I think we need to say that. I think we do say that now in ProAction. And so there's some things that, that gets factored into the cost of production, and that goes off into the supply management system. But there are lots of other things where, no, it doesn't necessarily cost us anymore. And that primarily is what we do, is we try to come up with solutions. I mean, for example, everything we've been talking about, cow health, cow lameness, this isn't a way of costing farmers more money. This is a way of ultimately improving the lives of those cows, but also, of course, improving the lives of the farmers, because nobody likes dealing with sick or lame cows.
And I guess that my last point is just to circle back to where we started. We're able to do all this because of the IRC, because of our working relationship with the dairy farmers and the dairy industry. It's great. My phone rings, or Dan phone's rings, and it's a farmer that, has got a question that we have to answer, and we love that. We love the fact that, we have these strong ties that, many of our good friends are dairy farmers now, because, we've met them through this common vision of trying to figure out how to improve practices on farm.
And I think just on that, super important is that it's also, because we've got this long relationship, they're used to us telling it like the way it is.
Yeah.
And so we do have, through research, and because we're based here in Vancouver too, we do get a lot of sort of a sense of our finger on the pulse of the public views on a lot of these things. And of course we do research on the way the cow sees the world too. And so the benefit of our long-term sort of relationship of trust is that, they know that when we say something, that we've got good reasons for saying it. And they also know that we're not bringing these things up. We're not talking about disbudding to make the industry look bad. We're talking about disbudding to get the process to work. So at the end of the day, we've got an industry that we can all be proud of, and that we can make sure really does fit the practices that fit the values of our broader society.
And I think that's the other thing. I mean, something else that we bring to the table is, pre-COVID, we are very fortunate to also travel to other places in the world. And that's something that I think I've had a number of farmers ask me. So, what's happening in Europe? What's happening in Australia? What's happening in these other parts of the world? And I think they've been very interested because, we know that a lot of these discussions start, particularly in Europe. I don't think there's a single discussion in Europe that, the timeline's different, but they all end up here as well. They just don't, they may take 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, depending on the topic. But if we look through history, and when, something that was a big discussion point in the 1960s and the 1970s in Europe became a big discussion point here in the 80s and the 90s. And so it's been rewarding for me when these farmers want to know, what's happening out in other places in the world.
No, well, I think that's the perfect place to end. And so I'll say thank you very much for your commitment to research and your commitment to dairy cattle welfare. I know it's something that we may resist you at some point, but in the end, I think we all get on board, and it's the work that needs to be done. So thank you very much. And thank you for your time today.